Hello and welcome to this week's lecture on the topic of accuracy and efficiency. So this week we're going to explore a few ideas around the topic of how accurate are the inferences that we end up making. So with all of the information that we've got to make judgments and to weigh up and make decisions, how accurate do we end up being with those judgments? I'm going to start off by talking about the concept of bounded rationality, so some of the limits that are imposed on our ability to make completely optimal decisions. We're going to consider some examples of when these inferences can go wrong, and then we're going to look at some of the errors and biases that creep in to our inferences and judgments that we make. And we're going to approach this from two perspectives. So there's one argument that a lot of these errors that we make are genuinely consequential. They're important and they have a big impact on society. And we're going to see from another perspective that maybe there's another argument that actually a lot of these errors that we so-called make, they actually don't really matter that much, and they're a little bit artificial. And finally, we're going to conclude with an argument that some of the rapid judgments that we can make can sometimes actually be superior. So just how accurate are the inferences that you end up making? And this is something that certainly in the early years of social cognition research, there was the assumption that our inferential processes follow essentially a kind of optimal path. And perhaps this is something that prior to you taking this degree, it's probably something that you might have viewed your thought processes in this way as well. And just to clarify, when I talk about inferences, what I mean is our capacity and ability to take evidence, to sample evidence and to be able to weigh this up in order to come up with some decision, solution or evaluation using that evidence. And it sort of makes sense that we would expect our thought processes to be optimal. So our goal most of the time is to try and make accurate evaluations, accurate decisions. So if we're deviating from this, surely we would kind of notice and realize and work to correct our inferences. So generally, we believe that our inferential processes are rational. So they're following a rational process that involves kind of paying conscious attention. We engage in very thorough processes. We follow logic, and we end up with a kind of accurate inference at the end. However, it turns out in reality that we end up using multiple different heuristics and shortcuts. And our actual inferential processes can often be a little bit rubbish, I guess. And when I say they're rubbish, it's because they don't necessarily fit with the sort of normative model. So if we think of a normative model would be the most logical or best fitting or predictive model that you could build in order to maximize expected utility. So certainly for human information processing and human decision making, a lot of the time we've thought that the best decision that you can make is always going to be the one that maximizes the amount of payoff for you and minimizes the amount of punishment. So that would be a kind of good starting place of what would be the best decision that you could make in any given situation. And we find that often the decisions that we end up making don't necessarily follow the kind of best normative model that you could build. And one way you can think about a sort of normative model is if you were to build a robot, so build like a Terminator, and wanted this Terminator to make the very best optimal decision at every possible turn that's going to maximize results. This would be who we're comparing our own decisions against. And we find out that there are very predictable and systematic biases in how we sometimes deviate from these models. And that's what we're going to explore today. So some explanations for why are people suboptimal in their inferential processes. And it turns out there's several explanations for this. So the first one is that we typically have this really strong pressure for efficiency. So if we're, say for example, walking down the street and you see 2 restaurants that are there and you're trying to decide on which one of these do we want to go for lunch, we don't have all day to make this decision regarding whether one restaurant is going to be better than the other. So is it the case that the waiter in one of them is going to be helpful or unfriendly? What is the food going to be like in one of these or the other? Typically what you might do is make a relatively rapid decision that I just want to go into this restaurant and not the other one. So I'm not going to weigh up every single possible detail. And by doing that, you are going to deviate often from making what is necessarily the optimal decision, but it's a reasonable trade-off that you're making there. It's also the case we've got limited resources to actually process all of the possible information that could inform our decision. So we can't take in every bit of information from every source around us. There's just too much in order to weigh up. So even if we had every possible analytical piece of information about these 2 restaurants that we might want to go in, so for example, if you looked at Google reviews and you read every single review that is there for these 2 restaurants, it's still very challenging to actually take all of this information and to accurately weigh it up. So how do you hold into account 100 reviews for this restaurant, 100 reviews for this other restaurant? So balancing and weighing up all the relative pros and cons of these 2 is really tricky business. So what you much more likely to do instead is probably rely on a simple heuristic of, on average, what is the rating for this restaurant? It gets a 4.7. What's the rating for this restaurant? It gets a 4.2. I'm going to go in the restaurant that has the highest rating of the 4.2. Now it's worth saying that we've got individual differences in the regards to how this happens. So as someone who is currently searching for hotels to go on holiday at the weekend for a weekend break, I've spent the last 3 days reading different reviews for every possible hotel in Krabi, much to the infuriation of my wife. So there are differences in the degree to which people want to maximize the value of their choices. So you have these kind of maximizers and satisficers. So satisficers will kind of take the one that seems satisfactory. Maximizers will really want to take on board as much information as possible. And it definitely turns out the case that being a maximizer is often not a lot of fun. Similarly, when making choices, rather than always using the available information, sometimes we base our decisions on prior information, prior beliefs, prior expectations. So stuff that is stored in long-term memory. So for example, having knowledge that a kind of past visit to a shabu place has been pretty disappointing. If one of these restaurants is a shabu place, it might look really inviting, but that past memory that you have of the shabu tells you that it is kind of bland, a little bit boring. That's enough to sway your decision making and inferences in the current situation. So we also find that our personal goals can influence our inferences. So a good example of this is to think of what might happen if you're trying to make an inference based on a text conversation that you're having with someone that you're romantically interested in. If they sign off one of their text messages, so you're chatting on WhatsApp, and they put a little X at the end of it, your personal motivation here is to see or believe that this other person is also attracted to you. So it'd be very easy to make an inference that they've signed off with an X at the end. That's maybe a kind of subtle indicator that they've got some shared attraction towards you. My favourite example of kind of inaccurate inferences is a screenshot of a chat conversation between a guy and a girl, where the guy is asking the girl what film she's watching, and then presumably without too much of a pause, she responds with "P.S. I love you," and his response is rather humorously the sort of over the top response and interpretation that this girl has clearly kind of admitted her infatuation for him, and he's like, oh my god, I love you too. And then she has to awkwardly remind him that she's watching the film called P.S. I Love You, which is a rather deep burn for this poor fellow. Okay, let's begin by considering where things can go wrong at specific stages of our social inferences. So the very earliest stage, one reason our inferences can go wrong is because we end up taking shortcuts when we're actually gathering the information that we need in order to make our decision and our inference. So whereas a normative model would assume that we take all of the information in and we process all of it, in reality we're a little bit biased in terms of the details and information that we pick up and end up processing. And if we're gathering and processing sort of biased information, we're going to produce biased responses. And again, not that this is always bad. As I've already mentioned, we can't take in and process every single bit of information that's out there. So it makes sense that at some degree we should be sort of selective in the information that we take in, that we gather. We should be selective that we only gather information that is going to be most useful for informing our decision. So for example, if you think about a doctor that's having to make a complicated diagnosis, the information that they seek from the patient is going to be based on their pre-existing expectations of the disease, based on the patient's history and the prevalence of the disease. So you're not going to ask the patient a bunch of information that you don't necessarily is going to be directly relevant to informing your judgment or your diagnosis right now. Similarly, if we have an expectation that a restaurant is not going to be good, it might be the case when you're looking for information. So you're reading through the different reviews. You might end up searching out information that supports your own perspective or your own belief. So if you're there and there's kind of a couple of friends and you're trying to decide which place you want to go to, and someone suggests this shabu shabu place that you clearly don't want to go, you might be more likely to then jump on and highlight the kind of more negative reviews that come out towards this shabu shabu place. Similarly, once we've decided what information is going to be relevant for making this inference or decision, you've then got to make a decision of where do we want to sample that information from. And we can be very much biased in the way that we do this. So for example, when I'm sampling your opinions on this course, I would ask all of you at the end of the course to fill in an evaluation form. But if it was the case that I wanted to sample a kind of more positive review from you, it might be the case that I just choose to ask certain people. So I select individuals who I think would give a kind of more positive or more favourable rating towards me. Or it might be the case that if you imagine a painting that you've produced or some bit of artwork that you've done and you want some feedback on it, then you're much more likely to choose your friends and your family, who presumably should be quite kind in their appraisals, to give their opinion on it, rather than necessarily posting it online or asking for an art critic to review this information. Our estimates and inferences can also be thrown off by encountering extreme examples. So imagine the example of, this is something that happened to me many years ago now. I was being robbed at a knife point in Rio. I could make an inference then that the city of Rio is just an unsafe place to be. But the problem is that I'm taking an extreme example of the safeness of the place. Whereas in reality, there are probably many areas of Rio that generally are relatively safe to walk around. But that extreme example sits in our mind quite heavily a lot of the time and biases our judgments that we make about an area or any decision that we're making, really. We can also be biased from small samples. So this is also called hasty generalization. So we tend to think that small samples are much more representative reality than they actually are. So one example might be if you think of looking at the performance record of an investment banker, and you look at their performance record over the last 3 years, and it turns out that they've been performing above average for each of those years. What many people might conclude is that this fund manager or this investment manager is better than average. However, it just turns out that statistically, it's really hard to make that judgment based on such small samples of information. So all you've got here is 3 data points, and we're then suddenly making an inference that this person is better than average than other people, and we just don't know that information. What we'd really need to have a high degree of confidence is much more track record of his performance, of dating back kind of 5, 10, 15 years, etc. Typicality. So if we'd sold something isn't typical, we often fail to account for this or don't include this information when we later end up making generalizations. So an example that features in the text that I think illustrates this quite nicely is some research that was done where people would view prison guards who would either present themselves as being very compassionate and caring people, or they would present, so these are kind of non-stereotypical perspectives, or they would present as being very macho and inhumane. And in the study, participants were then told that this individual guard is either typical, so this is what all prison guards are like, or they're told that this prison guard doesn't represent the usual prison guard. He's a bit of a kind of anomaly. Now, if you then ask people to make a judgment and rate the criminal justice system, and this would include questions about the prison guard, they tend to be biased by what it is that they've seen. So participants would have a much more favourable impression of the criminal justice system if they've just seen this information about a caring guard, despite knowing that this caring guard is not typical of the rest of all guards that are out there. So yeah, we have this problem of we might see one instance, and even if we know that it's a kind of weird, atypical example, we're not very good at discounting the typicality information. Now, a really important issue here, and throughout psychology and your life more generally, is this concept of regression to the mean. This basically refers to that in any series of events where there is some degree of randomness or luck that's responsible for the outcome, when we witness an extraordinary or extreme event, if we then resample that event at a later time point, it's most likely to be followed by, on average, a less extreme or more ordinary event. So let's see an example to kind of illustrate how that might happen. So imagine that you've got a class of students that take a 100 item true or false test on a psychology exam. And now suppose all of these students have done no revision for the exam, and they're going to choose randomly on all of these 100 questions. Then each student's score is going to be a realization of one of a set of independent and identically distributed random variables. So we're going to have if you're choosing truly at random and there's just a true or false options, the expected mean, so the average score, is going to be 50 out of 100. But naturally, down to a bit of luck, some students are going to score substantially above 50 and some are going to score substantially below 50. It's going to be just down to pure chance. And if we then sampled the students who scored in the top 10% and we now give them another test, what do you expect would happen to their test scores? If they're again choosing randomly, you would expect their average score of this sample would be closer to 50 on the second test. So they got lucky on the first one, you don't expect them to necessarily get lucky again. So the mean of the students would regress all the way back to the mean of all of the students who took the original test. So no matter what a student scores on the original test, the best prediction of their score on the second test is going to be 50. We know that they're choosing by random. Now, if for the case that there wasn't any luck, either good or bad, or random guessing involved in the answers supplied by the students, so if it was purely, exclusively down to their intelligence and knowledge of psychology, then you would expect students to get the same score on the second test as they did on the first test. So there wouldn't be any regression back towards the expected mean. Now, most realistic situations fall somewhere between these two extremes, and our performance is then going to be determined by a combination of both skill and luck. So, for example, how well you end up doing on an exam is going to depend on some part how well you've studied and revised for this exam, plus also how lucky you get during the exam. So whether the questions that are set for you are the ones that you've revised well for. And in this case, if we consider the students who score above average on an exam, this high performing group is going to include many individuals who've revised well, but also at the same time didn't have bad luck, together with those students who maybe didn't revise so well, but also had a kind of high degree of luck. They really hit the questions they wanted. So if we then retest this sort of subset of students who did well, the unprepared ones are unlikely to have a kind of a lucky break again. So on average, their performance is going to regress to the mean, while the prepared students will have essentially a kind of second chance to have bad luck and get questions that they find difficult, and they will also regress to the mean. Hence, those who did well previously are unlikely to do quite so well in the second test. But again here, the key part of the regression to the mean argument is the degree of randomness, chance or luck that's involved in determining this original performance. And the problem for us when we're interpreting fluctuations in performance and when we witness somebody perform extremely well or poorly is that typically we tend to interpret these fluctuations as being caused by factors related to the individual. So for example, in sport, we often think that an athlete who's done well for a couple of games, that we think that they're on a hot streak, that there's something about their sort of performance level that's explaining why they're doing well, whereas often it is much more simply attributable to the fact that they have a little bit of luck during a couple of games, and it's unlikely that their high level of performance is going to be repeated in future occasions. So we latch on to explanations for why their performance has increased or decreased, and very rarely place enough attention on the potential of luck and randomness. So a couple of examples from soccer of regression to the mean effects that occur there. One nice example of this regression to the mean in action every week and how it influences people's decisions and choices is to watch what happens in the Fantasy Premier League. So in this, you've got, I think this year there's over 7 million people that are competing in this, what's known as a Fantasy Premier League, where your goal is to try and assemble each week the best 11 players in a squad. And then each player's score is based on their performance from the actual games in the Premier League. So defenders score points for getting a clean sheet, attackers score points for scoring goals, etc. So you've got to find what you think are the best players who are going to earn you the most points each week. And you can see regression to the mean in action here, where occasionally you would have a player who has an extremely good week. So there might be an obscure defender who, on average, he's scoring very few points. And then one week, he scores a kind of mammoth bonanza. He gets a goal, maybe a couple of assists, he keeps a clean sheet, and he's the highest scoring performer in the entire Premier League that week. Now what you typically end up seeing is that there's a rush of Fantasy Premier League players who then want to add this player into their squad for the next week. But the problem is, what typically happens is that this player the next week then goes back to performing very average. They don't repeat their heroics. And again, this is regression to the mean. If their performance the previous week is dependent on having a little bit of luck rather than necessarily their skill level has improved, then on average their performance in subsequent weeks is going to drop back to where you would expect it to be. Another example from soccer is, and this applies to many other domains as well, but if you look at a team that's performing poorly and they then change the manager, you typically see this kind of sort of bounce back effect that occurs when a new manager takes over the team, that suddenly the performance dramatically improves or increases. And often the explanation is that this new manager has kind of injected extra motivation or desire in the team, whereas in reality a lot of the time what's happening is that this is simple regression to the mean, that the team was going through a period of bad luck, they might have had particularly difficult fixtures, and then at the end of this it coincides with the time point where they've got to their lowest possible ebbs, they've got this kind of extreme low performance. At that point you change the manager, and there's kind of only one direction that the subsequent performances can go. They can only regress back towards the sort of average expected level of performance. There's also another nice anecdote that comes from Daniel Kahneman, who describes his experience when he's talking to flight instructors and making the argument that based on all of the psychological literature that's out there, praise is a much more effective mechanism for promoting skill learning. And after finishing his speech, one of the flight instructors comes over and kind of says, yeah, nice talk, but I've got to disagree with you here. On most of the occasions that I end up praising a flight cadet for doing something well, in general, when they try and do that same skill again, they do it worse. Whereas when I go and scold and criticize a cadet for bad execution of something, in general they do it better next time. And again, this is typically illustrating regression to the mean, that if there's some element of chance or luck in the fact that you execute this maneuver poorly or well, then on the next occasion, if you've done it really poorly one time, on the next occasion you're probably likely to do it a little bit better. Whereas if you've done incredibly well execution at one moment, on the next time that you try it, you're probably likely to do a little bit worse. So that's one nice illustration then, which kind of leads to the paradox that we tend to reward other people when they do well and punish them when they do badly. And if you think about for the cadet trainers, effectively what's going on here is that statistically they're punished for rewarding people. So every time they praise somebody that's done something extremely well, the typical end result of that is that the performance gets worse. And then we're at the same time rewarded for punishing people. So every time someone does really badly and we punish or criticize them for it, their performance gets better. And the praise and punishment is not really explaining or driving the change in performance. It's just this more simple regression to the mean explanation that's going on here. And regression to the mean is important in lots of domains, but particularly in a lot of psychological research. If you've got two groups that you're taking, so say if you're doing a kind of randomized control study, if you've got two groups here that aren't equal on performance at the pretest or the baseline level, so this can occur simply by chance, then regression to the mean is something that can explain why the group with high performance at baseline might end up getting worse, or if you end up randomly sampling a group that has very poor performance levels at baseline or the pretest, and then they have an increase in performance post-test, this can be driven by regression to the mean effects. Okay, another judgment error that we can make is known as the dilution effect. And this concerns how people go about combining items of information that they believe to be diagnostic. So in other words, stuff that is going to be useful for predicting some outcome. So how we combine this with items of information that we believe to be non-diagnostic. So when you're given one piece of diagnostic information, people make inferences based on this. However, if you then add on non-diagnostic information about the individual, so stuff that is irrelevant for predicting that outcome or predicting that judgment, this non-diagnostic information weakens the association. And this dilution effect kind of conflicts with our intuitive knowledge or understanding about how human judgment should operate. So logically, if we're thinking about this when we're given diagnostic information, you should end up making the same judgment or the same predictions whether or not you have access to this irrelevant non-diagnostic information. So it's suggesting something about our human judgment and decision making that means we're not necessarily good at focusing on what is the relevant bits of information and what is the irrelevant bits of information. So for example, consider I give you information about a friend of mine called Judith, and I tell you that she's 35, that she's lived with a woman for the last 5 years, and that her and this woman have now bought a house together. If I give you that single piece of information, you might reliably conclude that Judith is a lesbian. However, if I also tell you that she is a legal advisor, she drives a Toyota, and she's close to her siblings. So this is very non-diagnostic information that I'm giving you here. So none of this should relate to aspects of her sexuality. Now the dilution effect would be the argument that when you're given this additional non-diagnostic information, for some reason we end up discounting or diluting the effect of the diagnostic information on our judgment. So we'd be less likely to come to that conclusion that Judith is a lesbian. Now, in the example that I've taken here from a study by Tetlock and Boettger, this is a slightly sort of dark example, but they consider the dilution effect in response to diagnostic information about whether a person was likely to be a sex offender or not. So in condition 1, they provide diagnostic information to participants detailing that David is sexually aroused by violent sadomasochistic fantasies, and then David has a serious drinking problem. In a second condition, participants were given diagnostic information here that stated David wants to adopt a second child. He does volunteer work at the neighbourhood school to promote good race relations. So thus, in the first one, the information that you're given might lead to a prediction that he's kind of more likely to be a child abuser, whereas in the second condition, that diagnostic information is perhaps suggesting he's less likely to be a child abuser. Now, some participants were then given non-diagnostic information. So they'd be given in supplement to what you've already been told. You're told that David has an IQ of 110. He injured his back on a skiing accident. He's strong-minded and is rarely willing to back off on an issue of principle. David likes to tell jokes. So in theory, this should have little diagnostic bearing on the probability of him being a child abuser. And they then ask participants to rate on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely do you think it is that David is a child abuser? And this is what they find. So the undiluted condition, which we've plotted on the left-hand side, is the results when you're just given the diagnostic information. The diluted is when you're given the diagnostic plus the non-diagnostic or the kind of irrelevant information. And then we've got what's plotted here in red is when you're in condition 1. So you're told that he has these sadomasochistic fantasies versus condition 2 that he volunteers at the school. And the key thing here is that in both of these conditions, receiving that non-diagnostic information effectively reduces the extremeness of that typical response that you got. So if you just get the diagnostic information, we're much more extreme in thinking, yes, he's much more likely to be a child abuser here, and yes, he's much less likely to be a child abuser here. When you then combine that with the non-diagnostic information, these predictions kind of reduce much more towards the average. And one important addition in this study that I haven't illustrated here is that if people are then made accountable for their decision, so in other words, they have to go and justify their choice with a clear reason for it, they then diluted their predictions much more in response to the addition of non-diagnostic information.